Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here at tradeoff.com. Today we're joined by Dr. Nevin Markel. If you haven't checked out our other videos with Dr. Markel, definitely make sure to check those out as well. But for the sake of just going through his background real quick, he's worked with hundreds of professional athletes from MLB to NFL to NBA to NHL. We could rattle off a long list of the famous athletes he's worked with, but for the sake of this video, just know that he's the guy that we send our athletes to when they're struggling with injuries, stubborn injuries that are keeping them off the field. He's also the therapist that I've been working with for the past 3 years in my own career, and he's proven invaluable for my personal knowledge of anatomy, of rehab, of soft tissue. So without further ado, I want to get into the topic for this video, which is just looking at the topic of shoulder pain in throwers a little bit differently. So we commonly, you have a shoulder injury, you go to a therapist, he puts some, ice and stim on it, or maybe gives you some basic shoulder strengthening or band exercises. But what are some less talked about contributors to shoulder pain in throwers? Because, you and I both know it's not necessarily simple as just blaming the specific tissue that, maybe shows up on an MRI as damaged. Right. What are some other contributors to shoulder pain that you see in throwers that maybe people aren't as familiar with?
Shoulder pain, of course, you see it a lot as a throwing athlete. It makes sense because you're using the shoulder at high velocities and chronically. And I said, almost all your shoulder pain is going to be from either overuse or misuse. And misuse isn't usually something that everyone's conscious of, but I think more specifically that's just a bad allocation of forces or mechanics that add up to a problem at that joint, which shoulder and elbow are common. As we talked about in the previous video, I think it's helpful to understand how all of their joints function from the ground up: ankle, knee, hip, pelvis, spine, scapula, shoulder, the whole kinetic chain, as we say, how the force works through their body to create that velocity that they seek. Shoulder pain, we go to the misuse, and at least in my understanding, you see a lot of issues with compression and friction on tissues like tendons, ligaments, bursa that will create irritation, especially when you throw as much as most of you guys do. One of the things that I look at is, you can't really have mobility, which everyone seeks, without stability. And, the shoulder is, the most versatile joint, but it's more or less the most unstable by nature because it needs so much degrees of freedom to rotate and throw and do all these things. So I think there's sometimes a lot of athletes, even high-level throwers, are hiding some instabilities in their joint. And when the joint doesn't have the ability to stay completely stable, it loses what's called centration, which you have a ball and a cup, if you will, or in a tee. You see the ball, ideal mechanism for optimal functional rotations, where that sits directly centered in the socket, and that's the centration concept. And a lot of athletes will, unknowingly start to lose centration, from an anterior plane of the scapula or forward rotated shoulder and things as such. And it's not really about one tissue that creates that problem. It's usually the body's created that for some reason because of maybe lack of function at other joints. And when you throw for too long with lack of centration or lack of stability, I think you run the risk of overloading things like rotator cuff tendons and capsules and labrums. So I think looking at the total body, but also trying to understand how stable is that joint and what are the positions of those joints in space. And if you can improve those, usually you'll see shoulder pain change and function improve too.
You've created a lot of posts on this topic as well, as far as the shoulder joint being, again, such a mobile joint and having a lot of interplay between the agonist and antagonist. You've kind of talked about it as being somewhat of a tug of war between the muscles on the anterior and posterior side and superior and inferior side. Talk a little bit about that, as far as maybe what happens if kind of the pec starts to take over, right, relative to the posterior shoulder, and explain kind of this tug of war concept to everybody watching, because that was kind of an eye-opener for me when we first talked about that.
Tug of war, you could use that. I like synergy because you have muscles that all work with a role, to control the joint in their plane of space. So the pec would pull the shoulder, anterior and in, forward and in, but it has to always be opposed by an antagonist group on the back, the external rotators and posterior delta, etc. But those muscles, instead of just being a push-pull give and take, they work. The brain recruits them and the deep stabilizing muscles around the joint to stabilize and ensure that centration concept. So the rotator cuff really is role when the power muscles like a pec is contracting, is to keep the shoulder centrated and stable so it can rotate to its maximum usable range and create the most force. So I think the idea of muscles serving not just a role of push-pull, but a stabilizing role, I think that's a really valuable concept to use in rehab and in training.
So again, just to really hammer this point home, guys, basically what he's saying is the issue can be coming from anywhere, above or below the kinetic chain. If you have a pelvic asymmetry or instability, forward to back or side to side, or a thoracic spine issue, or maybe the pelvis is contributing to a thoracic spine issue, or maybe the scapula is in a poor spot, it's anteriorly tilted or downwardly rotated. And so all these joints affect everything else. The tissues, it's not just the joints, but it's the tissues. If the pec is super toned up because all you're doing is pressing and you're not doing any rowing, now you start getting into this internally rotated, anteriorly tilted position, right? The shoulder joint is basically, it's kind of at the mercy of what the rest of the body is doing, is the point.
It's the end of the chain, and I think an important concept to realize is one way or another, you know, even if the athlete lacks mobility in all the joints below that you mentioned, they're going to find a way to throw and try to get it out on time, but at what cost? You know, because if they don't have the ankle flexion or the hip rotation or the pelvic rotation or the thoracic spine extension or all the critical factors or the scapular mobility or stability, one way or another, you know, the shoulder is going to deal with that force, and if it has to take up too much of the force on its own account, I think that's where you see some of your shoulder pain develop. It's doing too much work or too much, it's overloaded too much for sake of the rest of the body not doing their job.
Right, and this is such an important point too when it comes to kind of this debate, especially in kind of Little League, but also in high school and even college, is this idea of workload and can we just blame injuries on one or two factors? And workload is kind of this commonly blamed factor, like oh, if you throw more than this many innings in a certain time period, that's why this kid ended up with a shoulder injury. But like you said, it's about way more than that. The guy with perfect movement, perfect organization of his body, perfect mechanics, maybe he can throw 2 or 3 times as much without sustaining that same type of injury because his shoulder's not paying the price that the athlete, who maybe only throws 2 innings, is paying because he has poor organization of his body.
I believe that completely. I mean, I think you could see that with some of the best pros. I mean, I think it's hard to have a whole throwing career and never have any kind of issues with overuse and injury because it's the nature of the game. I don't know if we're designed to throw millions of times in a lifetime with one arm, but I think that that's something we can account for and make it easier on the body by improving mechanical efficiency. And part of the concept of improving mechanical efficiency isn't just cueing. I think it's making sure that our joints, they're mobile where they should be, and tissues have high quality.
Guys, if you found this video helpful or interesting, Nevin has a ton of information out there online. Go follow him on Instagram at @anatomylinks. Also, if you're struggling with an injury yourself, Nevin actually has a therapy clinic in Charlotte, North Carolina. You can reach out via his website, which we'll link in the video description below. Thanks for watching.